Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. My name is Peggy.
And my name is Steph.
And we're speaking to you from the National Centre for Writing, our home in the heart of Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. In today's episode, Singapore-based Choo Yi Feng shares his approach to writing speculative fiction. He stayed with us in our residency cottage in October last year as part of a writing residency supported by the National Arts Council of Singapore.
But before we hand over to Choo Yi Feng, this month, January 2026, marks the start of a year-long campaign called the Year of Reading. A Department for Education initiative delivered by the National Literacy Trust, it's a UK-wide campaign designed to inspire more people to make reading a regular part of their lives. So we'll be joining in this celebration throughout the year with events and activities to be announced. But in the meantime, Peggy, it's just a great excuse, really. Tell me, what are you reading at the moment?
Oh, Steph, I may be physically present with you, but my head
and heart are elsewhere.
They're elsewhere. They're with this lovely big fat novel called Buckeye by Patrick Ryan.
Oh.
I'm reading on a complete whim. A friend recommended it to me while I was away for Christmas that she had read as part of her book club. And it's just one of those big novels that you just sort of climb into and walk around in. You absolutely live alongside the characters. One of those, and you're with them for so many years. I mean, it starts in sort of someone's born in 1918 and you follow them all the way through,
Wow.
So it's just the ups and downs, the exploits, the misdemeanors, challenges. I really don't want to say more because I don't want to spoil anything, but it's emotional. It's been emotional.
I love an emotional ride.
And I've only got about 20 pages to go. I wanted to finish it before work this morning. I didn't manage. So I'm as I say, I'm sitting here chatting to you, but I'm actually just wondering about Felix and about Cal and about Margaret and Tom and all of the rest of them. Really beautiful. What about you?
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. Do you know, because I spend quite a lot of time trying to read the latest books, books that are new out. And what I'm doing at the moment is I'm reading a lot of Daphne du Maurier because I inherited a collection of her books from my mum. And I was thinking, I've always wanted to read her stuff and I haven't gotten around. I haven't even read Rebecca. So I read Rebecca and I'm just finishing Jamaica Inn. And then I've also picked up, they recently published like a big collection of her short stories called After Midnight. And so I've started reading. I mean, it is a, when you get it, I got it for Christmas and I was like, this is like 800 pages. Like this is hard to read in bed. But I am sort of interspersing other reads with short story. There's 13 in the collection. So I'm going short story, read, short story book. So yeah, and I'm loving it. And I feel like I rarely give time to going back to read, older books and especially sort of, quote unquote classics. So I'm doing that this year.
That's
and then
lovely.
I might go back and read sort of the Brontes or something, which, I studied at uni and I loved. And I always talk about how much I love them, but I haven't read them in 20 years.
It's the beauty, isn't it, of going back to read a book that you loved. Jan Carson, who's a writer and actually someone I know outside of the writing life, but she does an annual reading challenge to herself where she reads somebody's work in entirety. So this year she's looking at Hilary Mantel. Last year was it Barbara Pym and possibly Shirley Jackson, who I know you also love.
I love Shirley Jackson.
It's a lovely way in, isn't it, if you pick and go through their whole life's work, really.
Yeah. And of course it's a bit stressful because there's just so much to read and so little time and, my to-read list is always huge. But I mean, just dedicating any time to reading is such a joy, isn't it? Even if it's just,
totally.
15 minutes before bed, before I fall asleep.
Absolutely. I mean, where would we be, really? I love it so much. So I'd appeal to our readers out there, our listeners. We would love to know what you're reading. Love to hear more about what you've got on because that's makes the world go round, doesn't it? A redirect.
Absolutely. And how you read when you read, audiobooks, graphic novels, anything.
Kindles, iPads, whatever. Let's have it.
I'm kind of interested. I'm very interested.
I'm nosy. You say interested. You're just nosy, Steph. Me too.
We're very nosy. Nosy people. Please let us know. And if you want to find out more about the Year of Reading and what you can do to encourage reading for pleasure in your home or your school or your workplace, visit goallin.org.uk.
And now, on to the main portion of today's episode and our conversation with Choo Yi Feng. Choo Yi Feng is an intertidal explorer, climate activist, ecologist and fiction writer. The Waiting Room is his debut short story collection. Elsewhere, his short stories have previously been published in Foglifter Journal, Anathema, Spec from the Margins, Queer Southeast Asia and Alluvium. the Journal of Literary Shanghai. He was nominated for the Pushcart Prize in 2022.
He sat down with writer and mentor Simon K. Jones, formerly of this parish, to discuss world building in speculative fiction and how his work blends elements of science fiction, horror, mythology, and more. Together, they touch on his month-long residency in Norwich UNESCO City of Literature, his method for developing mysterious, compelling characters, and how his interest in the sea and sea animals translates in his stories. So now, let's hand over to Choo Yi Feng in conversation with Simon K. Jones.
Hi, Yi Feng. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I think the last time we spoke was in the Rumsey Wells pub in Norwich a month or so back.
Yeah, a month back. I can't believe it's already been a month.
I know. And now you're back in Singapore, having spent a month in Norwich, which I imagine they're two quite different places.
Yeah, they are very different places. I'm missing a lot of things about Norwich right now as well. Most of all, the weather foremost in my mind. Yeah, I understand from what Caitlin mentioned just now is that it's a little bit cold right now in Norwich, but cold I feel like is exactly what I need right now.
Excellent. Yeah, I think most people who live in Norwich would be surprised to hear someone missing the weather. But
yeah.
But the one time I've been to Singapore, I remember walking out the airport and it felt like the climate, the air was just like punching me in the face. It was so incredibly hot and humid.
Yes, I know exactly that feeling.
So yeah, your fantasy. So when you were here, and we'll get to the residency and we'll talk about that and talk a little bit about the novel that you're working on without going into huge detail, because obviously it is under wraps still. But you have written and published a lot of short stories, sort of primarily around the fantasy genre, but you have a particular, from the stories that I've read, you have a very particular sort of slice of that you do, and your own interests and themes within that, which I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit at the start. And
yes.
Like in your biography, for example, you start off by being introduced as an intertidal explorer, and in the environment and ecology is kind of laced through all of your work. And where does that interest come from? Like, is it part of living on an island? Is the sea always been a key part of your interests?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure where I heard this quote from, but I remember reading it somewhere that we are all ocean people, whether we know it or not, because so much of our lives are dependent on the ocean in some way or another, right? It's interesting that you brought up Singapore. Singapore is an island nation, but we are also very heavily urbanized. So as far as the typical experience one would have growing up in a country like Singapore, it's very much like a very typical kind of city lifestyle. Not a lot of people get to have a lot of meaningful or interesting encounters with the sea or with the shore, because I mentioned that I'm an intertidal explorer. But I remember that I have basically been fascinated by the sea and by sea animals ever since I was young, when I visited the aquarium, and subsequently when information started getting shared about there being specific environments or ecosystems within Singapore which one could explore during low tide. I started doing that when I was a child, and I've just never stopped. I actually was just there yesterday. In fact, I did a walk yesterday, an intertidal walk yesterday, and we saw lots of cool things, lots of sea slugs. Yeah, so I think I just never get tired of seeing these animals all the time.
So intertidal exploration, is that you're essentially exploring the area sort of between the land and the sea where the sea recedes at low tide, and is that the space that you're talking about there?
Exactly. That is exactly the space. So it is a space that isn't always exposed. It depends on the tidal cycle. Usually you kind of have to hit the right window. You have to be at the beach at the right time in order to explore the ecosystems that get exposed at low tide.
Interesting. Yeah, what you were saying about Singapore being an island, but actually the urban experience is like, you're in a city. You wouldn't really necessarily know that the ocean is all around you. And I think being in the UK is similar in that being in Norwich, we're pretty close to the sea, but you can spend most of your year not thinking about the sea at all, even though you know all the land around here is actually quite low lying, so there's a very high risk of flooding all the time. But everyone sort of like, people don't think about it until all of a sudden, you know, something goes wrong and then the sea is halfway up your house. You know, the ocean does seem to, it has that kind of unknowable aspect. And I think in the stories of yours that I've read, quite often you have an element of the sea sort of colliding with the land, whether that's you know, the city or elsewhere, and perhaps those two areas not quite understanding each other. Is the short story a way that you figure out what you're thinking about the environment and the sea, and like how does your interest in the real world of the sea and the land and the intertidal space translate into the fantasy stories?
That is a very good question. I think definitely the short story has been a very meaningful space and form through which to explore my fascination with the sea. I think living in Singapore, and especially with it being such an urbanized environment, it almost can be a little bit unbelievable or unconvincing when I tell people that I've had these experiences of, you know, walking through lush seagrass meadows at low tide, you know, just like feeling the salt air on my face. It doesn't square well with the impression one would typically get, especially as a visitor coming into Singapore, right? A very urbanized environment, city of steel and glass. There is nature, but it is very managed. We're talking about parks, gardens, ornamental vegetation, right? And I think with the short stories, one thing that really drew me to writing about the ocean and exploring my experiences or my memories of the sea through short stories was just trying to make sense of this disconnect, contradiction or juxtaposition between experiences or environments which kind of don't really make sense with each other. They don't kind of seem to line up and form a coherent world, and yet they do, right? They are part of my experience. So I think when I write the short stories, often that is the kind of feeling that I'm trying to channel, which is a kind of almost surreal or unreal kind of experience, which I think quite a few of my short stories, like Plastic Bag Girl, for example, or Empire and Catastrophe, I think those are, those are kind of the kind of titles, those are the kind of titles that come to mind when I think about how I represent the ocean. Yeah.
Some of these short stories are available online as well, so hopefully some of the links to those can go down in the show notes, and we'll also talk about your collection as well in a moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, the way you then explore these themes through a sort of fantasy lens, quite often it's through characters that also don't quite fit, and they're trying to figure out, you know, where are they supposed to be? Do they belong more in the ocean or on the land? And that sense of the characters discovering who they are, but even down to like, what is their body? Like, how do they physically exist in this space? And I feel like the stories, they sympathize with those characters. You know, your point of view is often with those slightly outlier characters who don't fit into the status quo. And again, how do those themes kind of connect and interact with each other?
The experiences of characters who exist on the margins of society is definitely something that draws me a lot. Part of it is trying to make sense of my own personal experiences as somebody I wouldn't say that I exist on the margins, but I would say that there are parts of my lived experience that kind of fall outside of the typical framework of kind of how we're expected to lead our lives. But I also think that creative writing is also an exercise of trying to kind of transport yourself into a different kind of life and a different mode of thinking and being. So a lot of these short stories, which I wrote when I was in university, were also kind of creative writing exercises, or at least they started their lives as creative writing exercises, right? As forays into experiences which I may not have had firsthand experience of, but that I was interested or kind of curious about. That's kind of one way of talking about what drew me to those characters and those stories and those themes. Another thing, and to kind of like maybe tie it back with my fascination with the sea and with the intertidal. Something that I like to bring up when people ask me questions along these lines is that the intertidal zone is a very liminal space. It's kind of like a boundary zone between the land and the sea. It's very amorphous. It's kind of constantly shifting back and forth, literally, physically in terms of its morphology. It's subject to forces from both the land as well as the sea. So it is a very kind of interstitial environment. And I think that kind of makes it a very interesting or relevant or compatible frame to explore the lives and experiences of characters and people who also kind of fall through the interstices of society, of kind of like the typical expectations or frameworks that we use to structure our existences. So when I was writing those short stories, I was very interested in seeing how like these two things, which seem quite far apart from one another on paper, how do they kind of gel together and maybe even like synthesize into a new aesthetic or a vision of living and being.
Excellent. And I think what I've noticed as well is that by quite often having these sort of marginal characters or characters that don't quite fit into their settings within these short stories, that turns out to be a really good way to actually explore the settings themselves and to do some of the world building, but in a very character rooted way. So you're not sitting there having to explain all the background and do a kind of lore dump to just do the exposition of like, here's how this world works. Because you have a character who doesn't entirely fit into that world, you can explore it directly through them. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your approach to building these worlds, because each of your short story within quite a tight space of time has to set up a fairly unique setting that the reader can understand, but you do it in a very subtle way that often takes a little while to reveal itself as well. And it can begin seeming more traditional, I suppose, and then by the end of the story you have a fuller understanding of what's going on. But is the use of those characters to explore these worlds a deliberate thing, or is it just something that like a happy coincidence?
Definitely, it's deliberate and intentional. I think short story as a form is a very useful tool when one is just starting out in creative writing. I'm working on a novel now, which is a long form project, and we can talk about that more later. But yeah, when I was just getting into creative writing, into prose, I was drawn to the form of the short story because it kind of forces you to reduce a story to its very basic components, right? And it forces you to be, as you said, concise, to make sure that every word, every sentence counts and it kind of packs a punch and helps to move the story forward. And I've always been drawn to characters. I've always been drawn to compelling and mysterious and interesting and kind of contradictory characters. So it made sense. I guess it makes sense now on hindsight that when I started writing short stories, my stories were very character-centered, right? So yeah, that was definitely very intentional. I'm now now that I've kind of given myself permission to expand more within this imagined world into something of a long-form project. Then now I'm kind of like coming up against the problem of how do we then do meaningful or effective world building in that kind of a space, which I think we talked a little bit about last month, which has been quite a challenge for me throughout this entire project. So I would say that kind of like earlier in my writing career, of sorts, air quotes, writing career, it was kind of character focused, trying to understand how people kind of play out on paper. And now it's kind of more on the other end of fleshing out the world and filling out the world and making sure that this is something that a reader could really just like immerse and sit in for days, if they wanted to.
No, excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely get on to the novel in a moment and how different that must be to your previous work. But before we do that, we should probably mention The Waiting Room, which I have a copy here, which is your collection of short stories. And I'm curious about how that came about. Like, at what point did you feel like you had the collection? These are the stories that you wanted to put into an anthology collection, and how you went about getting it published as well.
Yeah. So The Waiting Room is my debut publication. It is a short story collection of about 12 to 13 short stories, and it's published by Epigram Books, who are my publishers. They are a Singapore-based publisher. So unfortunately, that means that the distribution is quite restricted. There's a lot of places around the world where you can find the short story collection sold in bookstores. Hopefully that will change at some point in the future, right? In terms of its premise, I would say it's really difficult to explain the premise. It's 13 short stories, 12 to 13 short stories. I'm a very genre agnostic short story writer, I think. So it blends a lot of elements of traditional science fiction, maybe a little bit of horror, a little bit of magical realism, a little bit of mythology and folklore a little bit. So it kind of just all comes together as speculative fiction. I think that's the best way in 2 words to sum it up. It is a speculative fiction short story collection. It reflects a lot of my personal interests and experiences about, the ocean and the environment, as you said, and about characters whose existences are kind of pushed to the margins of society. Definitely. I wrote a lot of these stories in university. I wasn't doing a creative writing course. My degree is in biology, which maybe kind of explains some of the marine and ocean parts of it. But a lot of the stories were just written with my friends in our interest group in university, our creative writing interest group. And it was also kind of a way of helping me to kind of process and make sense of my personal experiences, as I think all writing is about, right? Yeah. In terms of when I felt it was ready to be a short story collection, to be a book that could be published, I've been kind of going back and forth about this in my mind. But looking back on it now, because the book came out last year, in June of 2024. And now it's been kind of 1.5 years since then. I have also kind of asked myself, would I do anything differently now? Knowing what I know now, would I have done anything differently? And I think that I would probably have let the project kind of sit and bake for a little bit longer. I think I was, for one reason or another, quite anxious to put out a book, like a publication, just to have that on my name, which maybe a lot of new and starting writers can empathize with, just kind of that feeling of having your name on the cover of a book. I think that rush was what I was chasing for. But I think, if I could go back in time, I would maybe even think about changing some of the stories, or just letting the writing sit with me a little bit longer and thinking more about what the stories are saying to me and what the stories are saying to each other, right? I guess I've learned a lot and grown a lot as a writer, and learned a lot about what a short story collection is and what it does since then. Yeah. But basically the motivation back then was I just wanted to get a book, a nice book out with my name on it. And I prepared a manuscript. I sent it to the publisher, Epigram Books, and they found it interesting and they wanted to publish it. So it's a pretty simple story in terms of how it actually happened. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sounds like you need to do a second collection now if you've got all these new ideas about how you would do it. But it's interesting, isn't it? How, particularly when you're starting out, having a physical book is quite a meaningful thing. And I think as newer writers, or not even as newer writers, but every writer at some point hits a moment when they feel comfortable with describing themselves as a writer. And I think some people it happens very early, some people find that quite difficult and it comes later on. But certainly having a book full of stories helps.
Definitely.
In terms of moving from short stories to the novel, what was it that gave you either the confidence that it was the right time to do it, or was it the story that drew you to making that shift into writing a novel? Because as you say, there's such different forms in terms of pacing and world building. And I think especially in speculative fiction, the sort of science fiction short story is such an established thing. A short story is such a good space to explore speculative fiction ideas because they do tend to be quite ideas focused. You can, take that short story, explore that one idea really well, and then it finishes very conveniently. Whereas as soon as you have a novel, it's not quite well, I wouldn't say simple because short stories are not simple, but a novel, it requires you to do all sorts of other things and go off in a different way. So yeah, why was it the right time to do that?
There are both kind of pragmatic reasons as well as kind of higher or maybe more indulgent reasons. The pragmatic reason is, I think, just the demands of the market and of the publishing industry. I do think that, and I have seen from my own experience as a reader, right? I was a reader first before I was a writer. As a reader, I have seen that novels tend to do better with readership, right? And with the market and with the industry. People seem to be more interested to delve into the world of a novel. So then that kind of prompted me with the question of, well, if I were to write a novel, right? Since everybody's writing novels and everybody's reading novels, if I were to write a novel, what would that novel be? So I think that is really how the current writing project was kind of conceived. It started as a very, very simple thought experiment, and it just kept going and going and going, right? Yeah, I would say that was the germ of how this particular writing project started.
Yeah, I quite like the description of a novel as a thought experiment that just keeps going.
Yeah, like it was.
You keep going, and then all of a sudden you've got a novel, and you're like, oh, there we go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, how long have you been working on the novel? What is your sort of timeline of thinking? Because when you came to Norwich on the residency, that was your sort of primary project that you were looking at. Like, do you have a sort of completion date in mind? Do you have a sense of when it might exist in the world?
I have a sense of it, but I wouldn't dare to commit myself to a specific date or timeline. But I am aiming or hoping to have a full manuscript completed by next year. So to sometime in 2026, hopefully I'll have a completed manuscript. The novel, I guess it's a good question that you asked in terms of how long have I been working on it? But it's a difficult question for me to answer because the novel has existed in so many different forms and faces and versions, both in my mind and on paper, that I can't really, it's almost kind of difficult to place, I think the current novel, in terms of its outline and its premise, as I pitched it to you during our residency, I think it has only been in existence for maybe about a year, I think. And I'll kind of talk a bit more about why maybe a year. But basically, yeah, it was, like I said before, the novel started as a thought experiment about if I were to write a novel, right? If I had to write only one novel, in this life, I only had to write one novel and I had to write it now, what would it be about, right? And I started that with that question, but the other side of starting with that question, not in a more traditional way, is that you don't really have any of the tools that you need to write a novel. A novel is a long form project. It requires kind of dedicated amounts of time and energy and structure to kind of really pull together, I think, which one would typically do through a course, in a university, for example, right? So a creative writing degree, for example. And I didn't want to do that for a few reasons. So I kind of had to pick everything up along the way. And what that meant was that I kept writing half drafts and then realizing that this is not what I wanted to write, and then redrafting and then rewriting. So I was looking through my folder, my folder for all my writings. Just before I came to Norwich, I was looking through my folder and looking at in terms of this project, what are its previous lives? I like to think of it as previous incarnations, reincarnations of this novel. And there were, I think this is the fourth reincarnation of this novel, and it's the one that I'm the most confident of right now, that yes, this is the one that's going to see the light of day. So if you were to count all of this project's previous lives and previous reincarnations, I've been working on it since late 2021. So that's 4 years, and it's been 4 years of kind of running around and getting lost, which is difficult to explain in terms of what have I been doing with my time all this while. But it's also been a really exciting and productive time for me creatively. And even though I kind of like I have nothing to show for it, again air quotes, I've grown so much as a writer, and I've learned so many things, and there's kind of things that when I'm talking about my writing, I can just immediately say that, oh, this is that, this won't work, that will work. And I've realized that all of this comes through experience, through trial and error of this kind of like 4-year-long writing process. And it's been really fun. The decision to, the last thing that I'll add before we move on with the other questions is that the decision to make this writing project a fantasy novel, so deciding on the genre of writing, which usually is something that comes up pretty early on in the drafting process, that decision only came about this year. So it's really been kind of like a game of catching up and trying to take all of my earlier ideas and kind of retooling and reorganizing them to fit within the typical expectations and framework of a fantasy novel.
Interesting. And that kind of notion of reincarnating the story into slightly different forms over and over, like, is that similar to how you've written some of your short stories, or has that turned out to be a very different process?
Yes, it has. And again, this is not something that I kind of know immediately off the top of my head. So to kind of tell a little story about how long I've been writing, how long I've been exploring and thinking about writing stories or short stories or novels or anything, I've been kind of doing a little bit of repacking and unpacking of my personal belongings in my room, and I came across like a little piece of paper that was written at this point, I think it's almost 10 years ago. Just like a little like piece of creative writing that I wrote by hand on a piece of paper just for fun, without any intention of doing anything with it. And I completely forgot that I wrote this. So as I was repacking, I found it and I read it, and I was like, wow, actually I can see that this particular story kind of flows into some of the stories that ended up being in the waiting room, in the short story collection, right? And I think my journey as a writer has been a lot of this. It's been a lot of when somebody asks me, how did this short story come about? I can only stare at them and I say that I guess it was just kind of there, until I go back, I dig through my archives, and I do this almost kind of like archaeological work of recovering the things that I've written and thought about and obsessed over in the past, but completely forgot about. And I realized that, actually a lot of the stuff that I was writing back then kind of anticipates the stuff that I eventually wrote. So I guess my journey as a writer has been a lot of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be quite familiar to quite a few people listening as well. And it's funny what you're saying about how it can look at times like you haven't done anything for a long period of time. But that's the thing about being a writer, isn't it? That like everything you do, even the stuff you throw away, or even when you're not actively writing, like your brain's constantly like ticking away and running ideas through. And over time, you slowly get rid of all the stuff that doesn't belong in the story, and then you end up with a story at the end of it, hopefully. In terms of coming to Norwich, so I'm curious about how the idea of a residency, like, have you done residencies previously? Is this kind of like a thing you've done before as part of your writing process?
No, I actually have not done a writing residency before. This is my first writing residency, and it's also my first time doing a residency overseas. So it's been a really, really amazing experience.
Yeah, because it's interesting what you're saying about the fact that you studied biology at university. So you didn't go down the creative writing route that you could have potentially done at university. And is that because at that time you were looking at a different kind of career and you weren't necessarily thinking of writing as being the main thing? Or was it that you always wanted to have those other skills and interests and knowledge that could also feed into your writing anyway?
Yeah, that's a good question. I want to say that it's the former. I think that growing up in Singapore, although I suspect that this is true in a lot of places, not just in Singapore, growing up in Singapore, you're often told that working in the arts kind of has no future, or you kind of can't really make a living doing any kind of artistic practice. So I wanted to have like a backup plan of sorts, right? Which would be the degree that I ended up doing in university. That's kind of part of the reason why I did my degree in biology. The other reason is Singapore is not a very big country, and the university that I attended actually does not offer a program in creative writing. So it was very much kind of this going in with this energy of like, okay, we're just going to have to figure things out by ourselves, because, some of these resources that you would typically get, they're not available, but it's okay. We have the internet, we have communities of people online. We can kind of figure out how to do this on our own. That was kind of part of it as well. I also think that I'm just a person with many, many different interests. I think I have been obsessed with the sea, and by extension, kind of like the environment and wildlife ever since I was a kid, and I didn't want to let go of that obsession. So I don't really think I lost anything by not pursuing a degree in creative writing. I'm very happy that I did my degree in biology, and there's no regrets about that. I think we just, as people, we just have many different interests, and sometimes all those interests kind of talk to each other, and it's fun to see what kind of arises out of that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting what you're saying, about that particular university didn't have creative writing, because in the UK, the whole idea of higher education for the arts is constantly under threat and under debate, and like, is it worth it? Does it provide value? And all this kind of thing. And sometimes the arts is quite a difficult thing to put a specific number on. But for those of us who work in and around it, we have our own personal value, I suppose. But I think one thing that people who do study creative writing at a kind of university level, what they get is they get the dedicated time to focus on the writing, which if you don't study it, I think we were always constantly scrabbling to find the time to do the writing that we want to do. And the residency, to bring it back to that, I was quite envious of you, I think, when you were here, because I was like, a whole month where like you're given permission to just work on the book for that entire month. You don't have to do anything else.
That's
definitely
very
exciting.
Yeah, that was, you've got it exactly. I think that was the biggest takeaway. The biggest main takeaway that I had from the residency was just having a dedicated time, as well as a space, Dragon Hall, very, very beautiful and quiet and very peaceful Dragon Hall. Having that time and space to work on my project has been tremendously helpful in helping me to kind of make sense of where it's going and where I want it to go. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's almost kind of difficult to put into words or to describe what that does, I guess, having the time and space to work on a project. But it really is about, it changes the way that you think, it changes the way that it becomes your priority. It becomes the thing that you wake up, looking forward to doing, instead of the thing that you do after you've done everything else. And I think that just changes the game completely, And yeah, that was my biggest takeaway from the writing residency in Norwich, and it's the biggest thing I think I'll miss about being in Norwich. Yeah,
I was going to say that, like, how do you then bring that back with you when you go back to Singapore? When anyone finishes a residency and they get that experience, what you want to do is somehow find a way to carry it on. But I suppose when you get back to the rest of your life, then the rest of your life gets in the way.
Yeah, definitely. The rest of my life got in the way in a big way. So my family actually decided to do home renovation while I was away in Norwich. So I ended my residency in Norwich at the end of October. As of the time of this recording, we're kind of going into the second week of December. But that time in between now and then has just been super chaotic. I've been kind of like moving back and forth and like haven't really had as much time to write as I would like to, I think. And I don't have the answers, right? I wish I had the answers on how we can kind of balance all of these competing interests in our life. But I think the biggest thing for me right now is that, and something that I learned because of my writing residency at Norwich, is that it's only going to be written if you set aside the time and the space for it, right? And then if you keep on putting it off and saying like, oh no, I have this other thing, or like that other thing that's like more pressing and urgent, then it's never going to get written. And it's going to languish in your drafts, in your folders of all the dead and unfinished drafts that you've never been able to put out. As the writer, as the creator of the work, I think we have a duty to the words to really put them on that pedestal and make them kind of the focal center of our lives, even if it's not all the time. I think we kind of have to do that. We owe it to our craft and to the words to do that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's surprising, like when you do manage to carve out some time, it's surprising how that can add up to something quite special, whether it's, a short story collection or a novel or what have you. Because while, residencies are lovely and we'd all like to be able to spend months and months just doing this, that's not always the reality. But actually, like, you don't need that in order to accomplish what you need. I mean, as you were saying, that kind of the thought experiment that just keeps going until it turns into a novel, that can happen regardless of how little time you have, I suppose. So in terms of the multiple reincarnations of the novel, do you have a sense yet whether this is going to be the one, or might there be some more reincarnations to come?
That's a good question. I do personally think that this current incarnation, which is to kind of explain it to the people, to the listeners who might not have I've not kind of like given a proper breakdown of what it is. So this is a fantasy novel that draws on Southeast Asian mythology. It draws heavily on Southeast Asian mythology, and it also draws on the specific kind of physical environment of the archipelago. So kind of a story that takes place across multiple islands with lots of hopping on ships and running from one island to another, or sailing from one island to another. So kind of, I guess the sea still kind of plays a role somewhere there as well, maybe a little bit more in the background. And then with lots of like mythological beings as well, because the folklore and mythology of Southeast Asia is very, very dense and very, very rich and storied. And there's lots of things to dig into there, which lots of other writers are doing as well. It's not just me, right? So that is the kind of current incarnation. I do strongly believe that this is the incarnation that I'm going to be able to send out into the world and see, in a book, with a cover with my name on it. That's what I'm saying right now. That's what I believe. But what I've noticed with my writing is that sometimes the words and the writing has its own opinion on what it wants to be, right? And sometimes as the writer, I'm the creator, but sometimes I'm also kind of the listener. And I have to kind of like take what the writing is telling me and listen and kind of help it become the thing that it wants to be, as much as I also want to be the one to make it into what I want it to be. So yeah, that is like a yes and no answer, but the I think like gun to my head is yes. I think it's going to be the one.
Unless the story itself demands to be something else.
Exactly.
Excellent. Brilliant. Well, it sounds like we're all going to have to wait a couple of years until we can get our hands on this either way. But in the meantime, the waiting room is available in some parts of the world. So do check to see if it's around. And if not, some of your short stories are also available online for anyone to check out, right?
Yes, they are. And if I can, I'll leave a link for it, for all the short stories that people might want to check out online.
Excellent. And I highly recommend that. So yeah, I mean, I was going to say like what's next for you, but obviously the novel is going to be the next thing you're doing for a while. Yeah. And then whatever comes after that. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Yi Feng. That was brilliant. And yeah, I do highly encourage everyone to go and check out the short stories, whichever ones happen to be available where you happen to be listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Simon. Thank you for your questions. They were lovely.
A big thank you to Choo Yi Feng and Simon K. Jones for their time. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch with us, you can find us at Writer Centre on Instagram and Blue Sky. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk.
Did you know we're a UK registered charity? Yes, we are. And we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation today by heading to our website, nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk, and by clicking the Support Us button.
And if you enjoyed what you heard today, then please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating and a nice big healthy review, because that helps other writers to find us.
Thanks again. Keep writing and reading, and we'll catch you on the next episode.